The Arizona sun was a merciless thing that summer, blazing down on the cracked clay earth until even the lizards sought shade and the air shimmered like a mirage. Dust rose in lazy spirals off the old Mission Trail, and the faint toll of a chapel bell echoed across the San Simon Valley. To most who passed through, this was a dead land, too dry, too wild, too close to Apache country. But to Clara Whitfield it was home. At 17, she was the only daughter of Reverend Nathaniel Whitfield, a preacher who had come west from Missouri with little more than a Bible, a wagon and a stubborn faith that the desert could be tamed by God's hand. His mission stood like a bleached skeleton on the edge of nowhere, adobe walls crumbling, roof patched with tin and prayer. Inside, the benches were empty more often than not. The only faithful congregation was the wind and the ghosts of those who had died trying to claim the desert as their own. Clara had grown used to silence. She found comfort in the way the sun bled into the mesas each evening, in the haunting cry of coyotes at dusk, and the endless stars that turned the black sky to silver. But lately something restless stirred inside her, something wild as the land itself. The soldiers at Fort Bowie, just 30 miles west, rode past sometimes with their uniforms dusty and their tempers short. They spoke of Apache raids, of stolen cattle and burned homesteads, of scalps and vengeance. Reverend Whitfield called the Apache savages, warning his daughter to stay within the mission walls after sundown. But Clara had seen the truth in glimpses, fleeting shapes on horseback at the edge of the horizon, proud silhouettes watching from the ridge as if the whole world still belonged to them. There was power in that kind of pride, and Clara, though she would never admit it aloud, felt drawn to it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, her father stood beside her on the porch, a Bible tucked under his arm. "You've been quiet lately, Clara," he said, his tone gentle but probing. "You're a woman now, but still too young to be thinking of such things as love. The heart is deceitful and the devil has many faces out here." Clara smiled faintly, though her thoughts were elsewhere. "Yes, father," she murmured. Too young to love, that's what he always said. Too young to understand the difference between sin and feeling, between longing and foolishness. But she couldn't help it. Her heart yearned for something the mission couldn't give her, something real. That night, the soldiers came. They rode in under a banner of dust and sweat, dragging a wounded Apache behind them, his hands bound, his head high despite the blood that streaked his chest. Clara was sweeping the chapel floor when she heard the shouting. She stepped outside and froze. The warrior was tall, his frame lean with muscle, his skin bronze and sun-scorched. His long black hair hung loose, and even with his wrists tied, there was something defiant in the way he stood. His dark eyes scanned the mission yard once, sharp and unflinching. "This one's caught raiding near the San Pedro," one soldier barked. "We'll let him rot here till the fort sends word." Reverend Whitfield scowled. "Not in my mission. Take him beyond the walls and let the Lord judge him." The soldiers laughed, tossed the warrior to the ground, and rode away. Clara watched from the doorway, her heart pounding. The Apache lay motionless, blood pooling beneath him. The desert wind lifted his hair, and she saw then he wasn't older than 25. Maybe, but there was a gravity about him, something that made the air feel heavier around him. All through supper, Clara couldn't eat. Her father spoke of salvation, of duty, but the image of that wounded man lying alone outside gnawed at her. Finally, when night swallowed the valley and the moon rose pale and hollow, she lit a lantern and crept out of her room. The air was cool, smelling of sage and dust. The mission yard was still, save for the soft rustle of a coyote in the brush. She found him by the stable, barely conscious, his breath shallow. His wrists were still bound, his lips cracked. She knelt beside him, her heart racing. "Can you hear me?" she whispered, his eyes flickered open. For a long moment he just stared at her, this pale-haired preacher's daughter trembling before him. Then weakly he nodded once. Clara brought him water from the trough, tilting it gently to his lips. He drank in silence, his gaze never leaving hers. When she reached for her handkerchief to clean his wound, he flinched, then slowly allowed it. The gash across his ribs was deep, bullet by the look of it, but not fatal. "I'll come back," she promised softly. "You'll be all right." He didn't answer, but when she rose to leave, she heard him whisper something. A word in Apache, low and musical. She didn't understand it then, but years later she would remember it every time she thought of that night. By morning, the soldiers hadn't returned. Her father preached his sermon to an empty chapel, while Clara slipped away to the stable again, carrying bread and water. The Apache was awake now, sitting upright against the stall. He looked at her cautiously, but not unkindly. She pointed to herself. "Clara," she said, touching her chest. Then she pointed to him. "You?" He hesitated, then replied with a voice rough as gravel. "Coda." She smiled, a simple sound, yet it made her heart flutter strangely. Over the next few days, Coda regained strength. She dressed his wounds, brought him food, and taught him small English words: water, safe friend. He taught her others in Apache: Dao, yes, Tu and Sun, Aya, heart. Each word felt like a secret shared between them, a bridge across the impossible. When he smiled, and he did sometimes faint and rare, the entire world seemed to soften. But there were dangers in every glance. Clara's father noticed her distraction, the way her eyes drifted toward the stable each evening. "You've been wandering," he said sternly one night. "Clara, you must remember, the Lord gave you youth for learning, not for loving. You're too young to love, too innocent to know its price." She nodded, her throat tight. But as the days passed, she began to see that love, whatever this was growing inside her, had nothing to do with age or innocence. It was something vast, fierce, ungovernable, like the desert wind itself. One night, as she cleaned Coda's wound, he caught her wrist gently and pressed something into her palm, a small carved piece of wood, smooth and warm from his touch. A star symbol was etched into it. "Morning star," he said softly. Guide through dark, her breath caught. She held the talisman against her chest, feeling its weight like a promise. And there, beneath the endless Arizona sky, the preacher's daughter and the Apache warrior looked at each other. Two souls divided by faith, bound by something stronger. Neither spoke, but both felt it, the stirring of a storm that would change everything. Clara didn't yet know it. But before the summer ended, love would test her, break her, and set her free in ways her father's God never could. The sun rose over the San Simon Valley like a blade of fire. The air shimmered with heat even before noon, and the faint smell of sage drifted through the mission yard. For Clara Whitfield, mornings used to mean sweeping floors, tending to chickens and listening to her father's voice echo off the chapel walls. But now her heart beat to a different rhythm, a rhythm that began each time she stepped toward the old stable at dawn. It had been nearly a week since the soldiers abandoned the wounded Apache at their door. Coda was no longer dying, but his strength returned slowly. The wound along his ribs had closed to a pink scar, yet he still winced when he tried to lift his arm. Clara brought him food and water, careful not to be seen. Each time she slipped inside, she closed the heavy wooden door behind her and let the cool darkness swallow her. Inside, the stable smelled of hay and dust. Shafts of sunlight spilled through the cracks, cutting across Coda's face as he sat sharpening a piece of stone. When she entered, his eyes lifted immediately. Dark, sharp, but softened now with something almost gentle. "Good morning," Clara whispered, setting down a basket of bread. He nodded. "Good," he said, tapping his chest. "Morning," she smiled. "You're learning quickly." He pointed to her, repeating carefully, "Clara." Then to himself, "Coda." "Yes," she grinned. "Clara, Coda." Language came slowly between them, but silence often spoke clearer. When words failed, they relied on gestures, glances, and the unspoken music of understanding. Some mornings she would sit cross-legged on the straw, tracing patterns in the dirt while he watched her with quiet amusement. Sometimes he'd hum low songs that sounded like the wind moving through canyons, haunting and beautiful. One afternoon she brought him a tin cup of coffee. He took a sip and coughed, surprised by the bitterness. She laughed, really laughed, the kind of laugh she hadn't known since her mother's passing years ago. It startled her, the joy of it. He looked at her, confused at first, then smiled too. "Not good?" she teased. Coda shook his head, still grimacing. "No good," he said firmly. Then softer, "But you—" "Good." Her cheeks flushed. She busied herself gathering the bandages, pretending not to hear. But the warmth that crept through her chest told her she had. Each passing day drew them closer. What began as mercy had turned into something dangerous, something her father would call sinful. She told herself it was only gratitude, friendship even. But every time she looked into Coda's eyes, she felt the ground shift beneath her. He gave her another word that evening, Aya. He said it softly, touching his chest. What does it mean? She asked. He hesitated, searching for the right English. Heart, he said finally. Also, love. The word hung in the air between them like thunder in the distance. Love. Clara couldn't sleep that night. She lay awake in her narrow bed, the sound of coyotes crying on the hills. Her father's words echoed in her head. You're too young to love. Too young to know the devil's whisper. But what if love wasn't the devil at all? What if it was the only pure thing left in this cruel land? The next morning, the stillness shattered. A column of soldiers rode into the valley, dust, sweat, and iron clattering against the silence. Clara watched from the chapel doorway as her father met them, hat in hand. The soldiers' leader, Captain Mason, was a hard-eyed man with a scar across his cheek. We're searching for escaped hostiles, he said. One of them went missing from the fort. We got reason to think he's hiding near here. Clara's stomach turned to ice. Her father frowned. We've seen no one, Captain. Only the Lord's creatures dwell on this land. The captain nodded, though his gaze lingered suspiciously on the stable. We'll search the perimeter. Clara felt her pulse pounding in her throat. As soon as the men turned their backs, she slipped away through the side path, skirts brushing against the dry mesquite. She ran to the stable, breathless, and burst through the door. Coda, you have to hide, now. He stood instantly, reading the fear in her eyes. Without question, he moved to the far corner where the straw was piled high. She pulled a blanket over him just as the door creaked open and the heavy boots of soldiers echoed inside. Anyone in here? The captain barked. Clara turned, her face pale but steady. Only the horses, she said softly. The men poked around, kicking through hay, peering behind barrels. Her heart hammered as one soldier's hand brushed dangerously close to Coda's hiding place. Then at last they turned away. Nothing here, the captain muttered. Let's move. The moment the door closed behind them, Clara collapsed to her knees. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath until now. Coda rose from the shadows, his face solemn. She looked up at him, at the man whose life she had just risked everything for, and felt tears sting her eyes. They would have killed you, she whispered. He knelt beside her. You safe? He asked gently. I'm fine, she said, voice trembling. But my father will find out. He'll know I lied. Coda's gaze softened. I go, he said quietly. You safe? No, she shook her head fiercely. If you go, they'll catch you. You'll die out there. I can't, she stopped herself. She couldn't say the words, but he understood anyway. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the desert wind through the cracks. Then Coda reached for her hand, rough fingers closing around her delicate ones. Clara, he said slowly, heart is not small. You think? Too young. He touched her chest over her heart. But here, strong. She met his gaze, her pulse wild. You don't understand, she whispered. They'll never let us, but he silenced her with a look, not of dominance, but of something purer. Trust me, that look said. The desert has its own laws. That night her father confronted her. You've been near that Apache, he accused, eyes blazing. Don't lie to me, girl. The soldiers saw footprints and they weren't yours alone. Clara's hands trembled. Father, he's not what you think. He's a savage. Whitfield thundered, slamming his Bible onto the table. He'll corrupt your soul. I won't let you throw your life into the fire. Something inside Clara broke then, the last thread of obedience. Maybe the fire's the only place truth survives, she cried. You preach love, but you don't know what it means. Her father struck the table again, but she didn't flinch. Tears burned in her eyes, but she held his gaze. That night, after he locked her in her room, Clara stared out the small window toward the stable. The moon hung low and golden, and somewhere in the darkness, she knew Coda was watching too. Love had begun as mercy, but now it burned like wildfire, dangerous, consuming, unstoppable, and though she didn't yet know it, the fire they'd kindled would soon spread far beyond the mission walls, into blood, sacrifice, and a love that would defy every law written by man or God. The Arizona summer bled into September, and with it came the stillness before a storm. The desert nights grew cooler, and the air smelled of rain and dust. Clara Whitfield hadn't spoken to her father in days. Since their argument, the mission felt more like a prison than a place of prayer. Every time she passed his study, she could feel the weight of his judgment pressing through the walls, the silent sermons that told her she'd fallen from grace. But she didn't regret it. Not one moment with Coda. Each night she crept to the old stable. Sometimes they talked, broken English and soft laughter echoing in the shadows. Sometimes they said nothing at all, only listened to the wind hum through the mesquite. The air between them grew heavier, thicker, charged with something sacred and forbidden. Coda was healing fast now. The strength in his shoulders returned, the old fire in his eyes burned brighter. Yet beneath his calm, Clara sensed restlessness. He would often stare toward the distant mountains, the dark ridges where the Apache still lived free. One evening, as the sun drowned behind the mesas, he spoke quietly. "Soldiers come again soon." Clara's heart twisted. "How do you know?" He lifted his chin toward the horizon. Smoke far off, campfire. "Too many for hunters," her throat tightened. "Then we'll hide you?" He shook his head. "No hide forever. They want Apache blood." She touched his arm. "Then we'll run." Coda turned to her, his gaze steady and full of something unspoken. "Run where?" It was a question that hung heavy in the still air. The world was divided by color, language, faith, and every mile of this land was carved by those divisions. But to Clara, the answer was simple. "Anywhere the sky still touches the earth," she whispered. "Anywhere we can be free." That night they planned to leave at dawn. Clara packed what little she had, a blanket, a loaf of bread, her mother's silver cross. She slipped her father's revolver from the drawer, hands trembling as she tucked it into her saddlebag. But fate, as it often does in the West, came early. Before sunrise, she awoke to the thunder of hooves and the sharp bark of orders outside. The soldiers had returned, and this time they were not alone. She rushed to the window. Torches flickered in the yard. Soldiers surrounded the stable. Captain Mason's voice cut through the dark like a whip. "We've got him cornered now. Bring the savage out." Clara's heart stopped. She threw open her door, ignoring her father's shout, and ran barefoot through the cold sand. By the time she reached the stable, 2 soldiers were dragging Coda out by his arms. His face was bloodied, but his eyes burned bright as ever. "Stop," Clara cried, shoving her way through the crowd. "He hasn't done anything." Mason turned, his mouth curling into a smirk. "Well, if it ain't the preacher's girl. Didn't know you had a taste for redskins. Let him go," she shouted. "He's not what you think he is." The captain laughed. "He's Apache, miss. That's all I need to think." Reverend Whitfield appeared behind her, his face pale as chalk. "Clara, get inside. This isn't your concern." "Yes, it is," she said fiercely. "You told me I was too young to love, but I know love when I see it." Her father's mouth fell open, horror spreading across his face. "Clara, no, but Mason had already given the order." "String him up. The fort wants a message sent." The soldiers dragged Coda toward a mesquite tree on the edge of the mission yard. The world around Clara blurred. She moved without thinking, lunging for her father's revolver. Before anyone could stop her, she aimed it at the captain. "Let him go," she said, her voice trembling. "Or I swear to God," the men froze. Mason's smirk faltered. "You wouldn't shoot." "Try me," she whispered. The next few moments passed like lightning, a blur of motion, dust, and gunfire. Coda, seizing the chance, swung his bound hands up, striking one soldier hard across the jaw. Clara fired once, the bullet grazing Mason's hat. Horses reared, soldiers shouted, and in the chaos, Coda grabbed Clara's arm and ran. They fled into the desert, the first rays of dawn chasing them. The sound of gunfire echoed behind them, bullets whizzing through the air. One grazed Clara's shoulder, a flash of heat, then numbness. But she didn't stop. Coda lifted her onto his horse and spurred it toward the open plains. They rode until the world went quiet again, until the fort was nothing but a shadow behind them. The desert stretched endless, a sea of ochre and sand, the horizon trembling under the sun. At last, they stopped by a dry riverbed. Clara slid from the saddle, clutching her bleeding arm. Coda tore a strip from his tunic and bound the wound gently. His touch was firm, his expression unreadable. "You saved me," he said softly. "I couldn't let them take you." He looked at her then, his dark eyes glinting with both pain and pride. "You brave Clara Whitfield." She smiled faintly, exhaustion pulling at her. "You make me brave." They rested there through the day, hidden beneath the shade of a rocky bluff. The wind whispered through the canyons like a song, and for the first time, Clara felt the weight of what she'd done. She'd defied her father, her country, her faith, all for this man. Yet when she looked at Coda, she felt no regret. Only peace. As the sun dipped low, painting the desert gold, he turned to her and spoke. "You go back," he said quietly. "Your people look for you." She shook her head. "They'll call me lost." "Let them," he frowned. "Life with me, huh? Not easy. Hard road. Always running." "I'd rather run with you than sit still in chains," she said. For a long while he said nothing. Then he reached into his pouch and pulled out a small stone, polished, smooth, carved with a sun symbol. "Apache promise," he said, placing it in her palm. "Two souls, one path. Never broken." Her eyes filled with tears. She closed her hand around the stone and whispered, "Then I promise too." That night they made camp beneath a sky alive with stars. The fire flickered between them, throwing their shadows against the canyon wall. Coda spoke of his people, of the mountains where he was born, of rivers that once ran clear before settlers came, of how love to his people was sacred, not spoken lightly, but lived in action. Clara listened, her heart swelling with each word. "Do you believe love can change fate?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly. "Fate is like river. You can't stop it. But love can change where it flows." When she lay down beside him, the desert was silent but for the wind and their breathing. For the first time, Clara understood what it meant to be free. Not free from danger or consequence, but free in the heart. She thought of her father's words, "Too young to love," and realized that love wasn't something measured by years or permission. It was something that claimed you, body and soul, and once it did, you belonged to it forever. As dawn broke over the mountains, Coda saddled the horse again. "We go north," he said, "to Sacred Valley." "My people wait," Clara nodded, slipping her hand into his. The horizon glowed pink and gold ahead of them. Behind them lay the ashes of her old life. Before them, a new world waiting, wild, uncertain, but theirs. They rode toward it together, two hearts bound by fire and silence, between blood and freedom. The journey north took them 7 long days and nights. The land grew wilder the farther they rode, red canyons giving way to rocky plateaus, then to pine forests that whispered with secrets older than time. Coda knew the land as a man knows his own heartbeat. He could read the clouds for rain, the stones for direction, the silence for danger. Clara followed him without question, trusting his word as she once trusted scripture. By the 5th night, her hands were raw from the rains, her skin burned by the sun, but she never complained. Freedom, she discovered, came with its own kind of pain, but it was a pain that felt honest. One evening, as dusk settled over the cliffs, they came to a narrow pass hidden between 2 towering ridges. The path wound upward through a canyon of ochre and violet stone, where the air cooled and the wind smelled of cedar. When they reached the top, Clara gasped. Below them spread a vast green valley, a secret world untouched by the wars of men. A silver river wound through fields of tall grass, and at its heart stood clusters of stone dwellings built into the cliffs. Smoke curled from their fires, soft and blue against the twilight sky. Coda stopped his horse and looked down with quiet pride. "My home," he said simply. Clara's heart swelled. "It's beautiful," she whispered. When they descended into the valley, the Apache came to meet them. Tall men with hair as black as midnight, women wrapped in woven blankets, children peering curiously from behind their mothers' skirts, their eyes fixed on Clara, a white woman in torn clothes, pale-haired, riding behind one of their warriors. A murmur ran through the crowd. An older man stepped forward, his face lined with wisdom and time. His name was Chief Nantan, Coda's uncle and leader of their band. He spoke in Apache, and Coda answered with steady respect. The exchange was quiet but tense. Clara understood only fragments, her own name, the word Bilagayana, white woman, and finally Coda's tone softening as he said, "Aya." The chief studied her for a long moment. Then with a slow nod he turned and motioned them forward. "She stay," Coda said gently. "They trust me." "But must prove?" Clara asked, unsure. He smiled faintly. "Heart must be strong to live with my people," and so began her life among the Apache. The first days were hard. The women watched her with wary eyes. She couldn't speak their language beyond the few words Coda had taught her. and every task seemed to mark her as an outsider. When she tried to help grind corn by the river, her hands blistered. When she carried water, the pot slipped and shattered. But she refused to give up. Each morning she rose before dawn to help with the fires. She learned to kneel in silence when the elders prayed to the rising sun, to give thanks to the spirits of the land, the water, the sky. Slowly, the Apache began to see her not as an intruder, but as a woman who wanted to understand. Coda stood by her always, patient, proud, protective. When the young warriors mocked her awkwardness, he silenced them with a single glance. When she faltered, he taught her with quiet kindness. One evening, after many long days, she sat beside him near the river. The air was cool, filled with the hum of crickets. Her hands were sore, her hair tangled, but she felt more alive than she ever had. "You learn fast," Coda said, smiling faintly. She laughed softly. "Only because you're patient." He shook his head. "Not patient, just see who you are." She tilted her head. "And who is that?" He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Not child. Not girl too young for love. Woman with spirit." His words sank deep into her, soft as rain on dry earth. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "And you?" she asked. "Who are you, Coda?" He thought for a moment, eyes on the river. Warrior who lost his home, now found it again. The meaning was clear, her. That night the valley glowed beneath 1,000 stars. The tribe gathered for a dance, the drums low and steady, the firelight flickering against their painted faces. Clara watched, captivated, as Coda joined the circle of dancers, his movements fluid, fierce, reverent. When he turned to her, extending his hand, she hesitated, then took it. The circle widened to let them in. The rhythm pulsed beneath her feet. The flames cast shadows on their faces as they moved together, his strength guiding her, his breath mingling with hers. Around them the tribe sang, their voices rising like the wind in the mountains. When the dance ended, Coda led her away from the fire down to the riverbank. The water shimmered silver beneath the moon. He turned to her, eyes full of fire and tenderness. "You remember," he said softly, "when you say too young to love?" She nodded, heart pounding. He stepped closer, his voice low as thunder. "Now you know." He kissed her then, not the gentle kiss of stolen youth, but the fierce, eternal kind that binds souls. The world fell away until there was nothing but his touch, the river's song, and the stars burning bright above them. For the first time, Clara understood the depth of what love meant, not the romantic notions whispered by girls in church pews, not the sermons of her father's Bible, but the kind of love that lives in the marrow, that survives hunger and fear and exile. In the weeks that followed, she became one of them. She wore their dress, spoke their tongue, shared their prayers. The women taught her how to weave, how to crush herbs for healing, how to listen to the whispers of the wind. She learned that love in Apache was not spoken often. It was shown in action, in loyalty, in endurance. She and Coda were bound by a ceremony under the rising sun. The tribe gathered to witness as Chief Nantan blessed them. A cord of red fiber was tied around their joined hands, a symbol that two spirits had become one. When the ceremony ended, Coda leaned close and whispered, "Now forever." She smiled, tears bright in her eyes. Forever. But the world beyond their valley had not forgotten them. One morning, a scout rode in with grim news. Soldiers had been seen near the canyon trail. They were searching again, this time for a stolen preacher's daughter. Clara's blood ran cold. "They'll come here," she said quietly. Coda's jaw tightened. "We ready. We protect home." But Clara knew what the soldiers would bring, not justice. Not peace, but fire and death. That night, as the wind moaned through the pines, she stood on the ridge overlooking the valley. Below her, the campfires flickered, families huddled close, unaware of the storm about to break upon them. Coda came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "If they come," he said, "we fight." She turned to face him. "And if we die?" He touched her cheek gently. "Then we die free. Together." She pressed her forehead to his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart, the same rhythm she'd felt since the night they met. The same rhythm that had carried her through fear, defiance, and awakening. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the faint scent of smoke. The soldiers were coming, and so the sacred valley, once a place of peace, would become the stage for love's greatest trial, a love born in defiance, tested by war, and made immortal beneath the desert stars. The dawn that broke over the sacred valley was not gentle. It came red and wild, smeared across the sky like a wound. The Apache camp stirred in uneasy silence. The children hushed, the dogs restless, the warriors sharpening their spears and loading their rifles. The smell of smoke from the east told them all they needed to know. The soldiers were coming. Clara stood beside Coda at the edge of the ridge, her heart pounding like a drum. Below, the river gleamed faintly, a thin thread of silver winding through the valley that had become her home. She had thought she'd found peace here, but peace was a fragile thing in the West. One spark of the white man's fear was enough to burn it to ash. Coda spoke to the warriors in Apache, his voice low but firm. She caught only pieces of it. Protect the women, hold the ridge, fight for the spirits. When he finished, the men nodded and scattered into the rocks, melting into the land like shadows. He turned to her then. You stay with the women. With the children. Far side of the river. Clara shook her head. I'm not hiding. His jaw tightened. You are my wife. And that means I stand with you. Her voice didn't waver. Coda studied her, the morning wind stirring his hair. Finally, he gave a slow nod. Then you fight with me. But no fear, Clara, the spirits see courage, not death. She touched his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath her palm. Then they'll see my courage beside yours. They took their place on the ridge as the sun rose higher, the first glint of rifles flashing from the canyon below. The soldiers came in a long column, their blue coats dark against the red earth. The sound of their boots echoed like thunder. Clara's stomach twisted when she recognized the man riding at their head. Captain Harlan, her father's friend. The same man who had baptized her when she was 10. When he saw her on the ridge beside an Apache warrior, his face went pale then hard as stone. Miss Clara, he shouted. We're here to bring you home. Step away from that savage. The words hit her like a slap. She felt Coda's muscles tense beside her, his hand tightening on his rifle. This is my home, she called back, her voice carrying across the canyon. And he is my husband. Gasps rippled through the soldiers. Harlan's eyes burned with disbelief. You've been taken in, girl. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, she said. And if you cross this river, you'll be the one who brings death to innocent people. But the West had little patience for words. A single gunshot cracked the air. No one knew who fired first, but in an instant the canyon erupted in chaos. Bullets hissed through the air, the sharp crack of rifles echoing off the stone. Coda shoved Clara behind a boulder as dust and smoke filled the air. The Apache fought like the land itself, swift, silent, unyielding. They moved through the rocks like ghosts, their cries echoing with fury and grief. Clara reloaded the spare rifles, her hands trembling but steady enough to pass them to the men beside her. Coda fired with deadly precision, each shot finding its mark. But for every soldier that fell, another came forward. Then, through the smoke, Clara saw Harlan climbing the ridge, pistol drawn, his eyes locked on Coda. Coda, she cried, but it was too late. The captain fired. The bullet struck Coda high in the shoulder, spinning him back. He stumbled, falling to one knee. Clara's scream tore through the air. She ran to him, dropping beside his bleeding form. Harlan raised his gun again. Step aside, Clara. She stood in front of Coda, her face pale but fierce. You'll have to shoot me first. Don't make me do this, he warned, voice shaking. You're young, confused. I was, she said, eyes burning. But not anymore. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the cries of battle, the song of the desert wind. In that moment, Clara understood what Coda had meant when he said love was action, not words. She lifted Coda's rifle from the ground, aimed it with trembling hands, and fired. The shot rang true. Harlan staggered backward, his pistol slipping from his grip as he fell. For a moment, everything went still. The soldiers, seeing their captain fall, faltered. The Apache seized the moment, driving them back down the canyon. Within minutes, the sound of retreating hoofbeats echoed off the cliffs. The battle was over. Clara knelt beside Coda, pressing her hand to his wound. Blood seeped through her fingers, hot and slick. Stay with me, she whispered desperately. He managed a faint smile. No fear, Aya. Spirit strong. She shook her head, tears streaking her dusty face. You can't leave me now. He lifted a trembling hand, brushing her cheek. Never leave. Love not end, even when breath does. Then his eyes fluttered closed. Clara cried out, clutching him to her. Around them the valley was silent except for the soft rush of the river. The same river that had witnessed their love, their union, their defiance. The tribe gathered in mourning. Chief Nantan laid a hand on her shoulder. He fight like true son. You wife, you brave, she nodded numbly. He was my heart. That night they laid Coda to rest on the high ridge overlooking the valley. The tribe sang the old songs and the ones that spoke of warriors joining the stars, their spirits running with the wind. Clara stood alone beside his grave, the desert stretching endless before her. The wind rose then, stirring the dust, carrying with it the faintest whisper. Aya. She closed her eyes. I hear you, she whispered. Always. The months that followed passed in quiet sorrow. Clara remained among the Apache, her grief shaping her into something stronger, wiser. She took up Coda's work, tending to the wounded, teaching the children English and prayer songs. The tribe called her White Dove, the woman who had loved the warrior and fought beside him. Years later, when travelers passed through the sacred valley, they spoke of her, the pale woman who lived among the people of the cliffs, her hair silver in the sun, her voice soft and sure. They said that at sunset, she often climbed the ridge where her husband rested and sang a low song to the wind. Some swore they heard a second voice in reply, carried from the canyon walls on deep, strong, and filled with love. The old Apache called it the song of the desert wind, the sound of two souls bound beyond time, whispering to each other through eternity. And when Clara's time finally came, they buried her beside Coda, beneath the same stars that had watched their first dance by the river. The wind swept through the valley that night, soft and mournful, as though the land itself remembered them. Their love, born of defiance and fire, had outlasted the wars of men. It lived on in the stones, in the river's murmur, in every whispered breeze that passed through the sacred valley. Because some loves, the truest ones, do not end in death. They become part of the land, the sky, the wind itself. And so the desert still sings their story, the proud Apache warrior and the young woman who learned too late, and yet just in time, what love really means.